Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. As many of you heard the last 2 weeks, the way we'll handle the Q&A is we'll handle it at the end. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And of course, Mark is always happy to answer emails that you can send him directly, and if you need his email address, just let me know and I will pass it along. We've got a lot to cover, so I am going to just turn this over to Mark and we'll get going. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming out again or staying at home, I guess, maybe. I thank you for, and thanks always to Michael and the Wilton Library for their help with the series. He and I have already begun a conversation about what four-part fiction series will follow up in the spring. So today we're talking about the third of our four modern British novels. What's modern British about them? Virginia Woolf, one of her masterpieces, Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925. Her dates were 1882 to 1941. A little background, in 1917, she and her husband Leonard established the Hogarth Press in order to publish works that, in Leonard's words, a commercial publisher would not even look at. And when in April 1918, political activist and magazine editor Harriet Weaver, a great patron of James Joyce's fiction, brought the first four chapters of Ulysses to the Woolfs in the hopes that they would publish it, they declined, Virginia noting that it would be too costly an enterprise and that she found the book, as she told other people, indecent and boring. But soon thereafter, she commented in a letter to Roger Fry, a painter and critic who was part of the famous Bloomsbury group to which Woolf belonged, that she found what Joyce was doing interesting as an experiment. Quote, he leaves out the narrative and tries to give the thoughts. So that's what she wants to do in her fiction. In 1919, she's seen giving greater consideration to what Joyce is attempting to accomplish in his novel, which of course takes place in Dublin on a single day in June of 1904. And she wrote, it is an attempt to get thinking into literature, hence the jumble, told in episodes, the repetitions of words like rosewood and wedded ashes. And at the same time, she wrote in an essay called Modern Fiction, which I recommend to you if any of you want to know something about her theory of the novel, written at the same time, 1919, published in 1921, so a few years before Mrs. Dalloway. Saying that these writers are attempting to get closer to life, to preserve more sincerely and exactly what interests and moves them, even if to do so they must discard most of the conventions which are commonly observed by the novelist. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness. Let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than what is commonly thought small. And this continues the theme that I brought up in my first two lectures on the small society rather than the big society. And she characterized the novels of some of the great late Victorian, early modernists, H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, John Galsworthy of the famous Forsyte saga. She characterized those novelists as materialists, saying that they write about unimportant things like material things. They spend immense skill and immense industry making the trivial and the transitory appear the true and enduring. By contrast, she described Joyce's work as spiritual, doing away with the machinery of conventional fiction. So if you've read any Virginia Woolf, this is recognizable to you. If you've only read Mrs. Dalloway, you get it as well. Mrs. Dalloway began as a combination of two stories, one called Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, which was just a record of her everyday walking around the city. She had written several short stories where the central character was Clarissa Dalloway. And she eventually thought of the idea of her creating a party, being the host of a party, with the notion again of bringing a small society together. The other strain was a story called The Prime Minister, which she was never able to finish. And there you have in those two strands, the small story about Clarissa and her wandering, preparing for a party, and the big story, capital B, of the Prime Minister, who figures as background in Mrs. Dalloway, as does Big Ben, the world of public announcement, the world of public time. When she combined the two strands, her original plan was to call it The Hours, which is where Michael Cunningham, who wrote a great sort of homage sequel to this novel, got his title. And the idea was the hours are what we have. They are what fill our lives. They are what wear us down. Another name for life is mortality. It cuts both ways. The hours are what we spend. The hours spend us. And the idea was that the presence of the war, the 1920s, saw a number of novels that were first at enough of a distance from the First World War to process what had happened. So you get things like All Quiet on the Western Front, Farewell to Arms. Even The Great Gatsby, in its way, is a World War I novel. And the presence of the effects of the war were going to be carried in the disillusionment of Mrs. Dalloway, who it was planned would commit suicide at the end of the novel. The tension between the sustaining life of small relations and everyday activity, both the ultimate despondency about the aftermath of the war. It did not have a Septimus Smith character. And then she decided, for complicated reasons, and Michael Cunningham partly puts this in his novel, hypothetically, to save Mrs. Dalloway and to give her a better insight into the value of life. That happens in the closing pages of the novel when she hears someone, a doctor, talk about his patient Septimus dying. They never meet, but the shell-shocked Septimus Smith is how World War I comes into the novel. And Clarissa's first response is to treat the news of his death like a wine stain on a white carpet. She's annoyed, she's put out. She goes upstairs, kind of to a room of her own, and she contemplates what it must have taken for that young man to give away his gift. And instead of her dying, he dies. And again, all these reverberations are resonating in The Hours by Michael Cunningham. I invite you to read that book or to see the movie. If you're going to do both, read the book first. Septimus Smith is haunted by his dead friend, Evans. And the two veterans, one alive, one dead, Smith and Evans, are given very conventional, bland English names because they represent that generation of young men who were devastated, who were sacrificed to the war. So she writes her own version of Ulysses, that is a single-day novel. In the middle of June, we're told, Ulysses is the 16th of June, in a major European capital. So London, middle of June. Her novel takes place in 1923, is published in 1925. And at the center of it is Clarissa, first and last. Clarissa is 52 years old. Virginia Woolf is herself 59. People who knew something about Virginia Woolf and her fiction, she'd been publishing it for 10 years before Mrs. Dalloway, mistakenly assumed that Clarissa Dalloway was meant by Virginia to be a kind of comic or satiric figure. They could not believe that the very sophisticated, cultured, literate Virginia would have seen Clarissa as a society matron who was worried about getting the flowers herself and making sure that her party would come off as a success. People who didn't know what they thought they knew thought that this must be Virginia Woolf's joke at the expense of Clarissa. What they did not know, but what I know, and many people know, and you now know, is that in her notebooks in the teens and 20s, as Virginia Woolf was working on these novels, she used the metaphor of a host or hostess in her terms as an image of what the literary artist could best do. That is, a writer cannot solve the big questions of society the way the Victorian novelists thought that they could solve issues of the condition of England. Instead, the best they could do was to present again, that is, represent the world in its everyday occurrence and how valuable the days, the hours, just as themselves were. And to that extent, she thought of a hostess. Again, I'm using that word because it's her word. People now prefer to drop the ESS in actress and hostess, and so do I. But to present a hostess as someone who brings people together, valuable just in bringing them together. So I've given this example before, possibly to this group. You get invited to a party one evening by people you work with. Most of the people at that party are going to be people you work with. Some of them you're friendly with, some of them you barely know. You go home, you shower, you change, maybe you shave depending on the condition of your face. And you go to a party where you see people you see all the time. Maybe there's some music playing, maybe there's a good dip and some fine wine, whatever it is. And nothing at the party that you couldn't supply for yourself. And yet it's a party. It's something to do. It has a beginning and an end. It has a feel to it differently when you're meeting with 10, 12, 30 people than when you're home alone, having the same wine and the same dip. I don't say this trivially. I say this exultantly, that that's the nature of life. This event that we're doing now between the hours of 5 and 6 is not a party, but it's a gathering. And it has some value, not just because I hope you take away something from what I say, but it has a beginning and an end. It has a shape, like a baseball game, or a card game, or an opera, or a high school football game that you go to see. There's something infinitely enjoyable about that kind of recreation, coming together to watch or do something. Virginia Woolf believed in the wake of the First World War, which she and other writers believed actually threatened the continuation of Western civilization, that there's great value in those little things. And so she thinks of Clarissa as a kind of everyday hero, quite seriously, in bringing people together. The last novel that she wrote, Between the Acts, which was published just 4 months after her death by suicide. So Virginia Woolf had Clarissa originally planning to be killed by suicide. She saved Clarissa at the expense of Septimus Smith, but then her own struggles with mental illness took over. And in 1941, on the brink of another war, she walked into a local river with stones in her pockets because she couldn't bear that she was losing her sense of reality. And so Clarissa lives on, but Virginia Woolf took her own life. That getting people together, that having Peter in the room, that getting over the excrescence from her point of view, the faux pas of Septimus's suicide, and appreciating him as taking some responsibility for his own life. She doesn't know the details of his insanity, of his shell-shockedness the way we do, is a celebration of what a party can do, momentarily bring people together. And when she writes Between the Acts, that last novel published after her death, it is a series of pageant displays on the grounds of a British estate that shows the history of England, first in the Elizabethan period, then the Restoration period, then the Victorian, and then the present day ourselves. And when the last scene comes up, the last act, the woman director of that play, who we're told is a lesbian, Clarissa, you may remember in the novel, is referred to as feeling about women the way men feel about women. She clearly had some sort of past feelings about Sally Seton, and we know that Virginia Woolf had bisexual longings and relations. When Miss Latrobe, the lesbian director of that play, stages the last episode called The Present Time Ourselves, she has all the actors hold up mirrors of different sizes from the house, from the mansion, and reflect back on the audience their own faces. And the audience sees themselves, we're told, not whole, because there are gaps between the mirrors. You look in the mirror and you see yourself, and next to it you see a tree back 100 yards away, and then next to that you see your next door neighbor sitting one seat over. It says they don't see themselves whole, but they see themselves sitting still, at any rate, sitting still. And Virginia Woolf came to believe that what art could do, what the novel could do, is show us some version of life while we're sitting still, while we catch our breath. And she thought of that activity not as a sermon and not as a recreation of life the way you hope to see when you go to the cinema, but like a party where for a moment you catch yourself, catch your breath, even if all you're seeing is the same guy from accounting and the woman from the front desk and the woman who's the CEO of the company. But it has a shape and a form, and that's what she's celebrating. So I'm going to read several passages in this context, building up to the final scene in the novel, the last lines of the novel. It opens with the idea that when Clarissa goes out on that first day, she's excited about life. And this is what's the value for Virginia Woolf. The first line, its own paragraph, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And again, people who thought that that was a mocking sentence about Clarissa did not understand that for Virginia Woolf, someone who really wants to get a party right, and it's not just society women in early 20th century England. You throw a party, you want it to go well. You want it to go well for the sake of your guests, for your own sake, and for the sake of what it means to give a party. She's going to buy the flowers herself, not because she doesn't trust other people, but because she enjoys shopping for flowers. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges, Rumpelmeyer's men were coming, and then thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. So the doors have to come off their hinges so that big things can be moved through them. She thinks about a morning fresh for children. And then the third paragraph, what a lark, what a plunge. For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Bourton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet for a girl of 18 as then she was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. She doesn't mean terrible, she means awesome, awe-inspiring. She's 18 at the brink of adulthood. It's early morning at the brink of a day. The hinges that are going to lose their doors make a little squeak as you throw open the front door. That little experiential, sensual sound of the hinges and the doors flying open. And she is imagining a plunge into the water of life. It's glorious. And then on the next page, she talks about this walking around in the world, She's recovered from influenza, which has affected her heart. Of course, the great influenza epidemic of the late teens that we've heard so much about now. And a few paragraphs into the novel that begins, for having lived in Westminster over 20 years, it says that for heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, that is the air, the climate, life, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the various frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall. Do the same. Can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of parliament for that very reason. That is, you can't take care of the little people with big things. They love life, even the people sitting miserably on the steps, besotted by drink. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, the motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men, shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. London, this moment in June. That's very heady. And if you don't enjoy that catalog, that would be the literary term for that list, that catalog of urban modern life and the noise and jumble and swing, and you don't yourself, you have not yourself ever felt the headiness of being out on a beautiful summer morning and just imbibing the thisness of the world in these minor noises of the city, you will probably not be a fan of the novel. Now, to its credit, if the whole novel was an endless celebration of that kind of experience, a kind of sensory overload of Clarissa just moving from one kind of ecstasy to another, it would be not the masterpiece it has become, and I wouldn't be here this afternoon talking to you about it. But in fact, the novel rings many changes, and one of them is introduced just a few pages later, and then I'll stop talking at the midway point in case Michael has some comments or questions about what I've been talking about to pass on. I know at least one of our returning patrons asked a very big question before we started, acknowledging that it's a big question about the influence of Joyce and Woolf on the modern novel, the novels that followed. I'm going to demur on that question because I have all I can do in an hour to do justice to this great novel. So some pages in, there's a paragraph that is just a couple of sentences that said she had reached the park gates. She stood for a moment looking at the omnibuses in the Piccadilly. In my version that looks like this, it's page 8. And now I'm going to read part of this paragraph. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or were that. So she's not judgmental, a good thing. If you're a novelist, you cannot judge the characters you're writing about. You don't write good characters and bad characters. They're all characters that deserve your attention and your sympathy, whatever they might be if you imagine them as real people. There are good people and there are bad people, but that's not the business of a novelist. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. So this is that doubleness of her, of being in the moment and outside the moment, being a person of sensation, being a person of thought, feeling young and feeling old. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. That's the talent of a novelist. I want to make it clear, Clarissa is not a novelist. She's not even a stand-in for the novelist. She's not a version of Virginia Woolf, but they're on a continuum, because to be a successful novelist, you have to be able to feel the reality that you're describing, and at the same time to be outside of it looking in. You have to be in the novel and outside the novel. And then it continues, she had a perpetual sense as she watched the taxicabs. Again, this is a very urban novel like Ulysses, of being out, far to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. That half sentence, I'm going to read it again, is one of my favorite lines in all of literature. I haven't read everything ever written, but I've read a lot of stuff. My favorite line, one of my favorite lines in all of literature, she always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. That's an extraordinary sentence, partly in its unpoetry. It does not have a word that would trouble a middle schooler. There aren't any allusions or impressive diction. It's a straightforward recognition. And why is it dangerous to live even one day? Because stuff happens, because wars happen, because a man who survived the war loses his mind, because someone who's trying to hold on to the little shred of sanity that he has and is being taken care of by the love of his Italian wife loses that battle. Because life is so joyous in the celebration we've just heard of the hum and rattle of machines coursing through London in the middle of June 1923, that you can lose it in a moment. And everybody in this room has had enough experience and enough insight to know, and unfortunately through second or third hand experience, how bad things can happen in an instant. And that's why it's dangerous. To commit to the hours, to commit to plunging into life, is to also take a chance on drowning. And that doubleness of her feeling old and young, feeling in the moment and outside of it, feeling a joy to be alive and a recognition of how dangerous it is to live even a single day. That's the glory of the novel, Mrs. Dalloway. So I'm at the halfway point, and again, I prefer to talk with you than at you. I make concessions for our current circumstances. But if Michael sees a question or a comment that he thinks would be good for me to turn to at this point, I will before I continue in the second half. And again, I'll end before 6 o'clock, so there'll be time for other questions if anyone has them.
Great, Mark. Yeah, we've got a comment question here. Looks interesting. Do you see a significance in Clarissa's last name, Dalloway? I feel she did not dally away her hours. She appreciated her husband, visited sick friends, found pleasure in entertaining. She questioned life in her thoughts and found that Septimus in his suicide made her realize the beauty of life, or as Wallace Stevens wrote, death is the mother of beauty.
Yeah, so I want to say I am always very welcoming and respectful of people who try to ferret out what might be a meaning intended or just as valuable, unintended by the author, but picked up by a reader. So it doesn't matter to me if someone convinces me that the last name of someone means something and I'm convinced. It doesn't matter to me if the author intended it, because that's not how literature works. An author doesn't have to intend something for the meaning to come through. So I think it's certainly possible, and I'm not saying this in a patronizing way, that Dalloway can be the opposite of what she does. Although you could also say that she's comfortable enough in her own skin that she doesn't mind dallying away some of her existence. She's not a prime minister. She's not a stockbroker. She's not a person of business. She's a wife and a mother, and for the purposes of this novel, she's hosting a party. I've always been more drawn to her first name because I think Clarissa brings up the notion of clarity. And one of the things this novel does is it works hard to present to us what it is to actually see, to apprehend another person. What does it mean to be Clarissa Dalloway? And you'll remember that the last line of the novel, its own sentence, its own paragraph, is, "For there she was." And when my poor undergraduates who've been bred on reading other kinds of novels encounter in my classes, when I used to teach modern British fiction, Mrs. Dalloway, they're crestfallen to know what they can make of the ending. And they're hoping they don't have to write a paper on Mrs. Dalloway, that they can write it on The Secret Agent or Brighton Rock or Howard's End or one of the many other novels that have more of a plot, unless they are people who naturally gravitate to Virginia Woolf's style. One of the things the novel tries to do is to make Mrs. Dalloway clear. And again, if this were a 19th century novel, the novel would want to communicate some big idea about independence or self-knowledge, Pip learning a lesson, capital L, about the world, capital W. Instead, it labors to try to show us what it is to be a person in a small society. And we'll look at that ending in a few minutes from now. But I think her first name is very, very significant. Is there another question or comment you want to give to me, Michael?
Not at this point. If you want to keep going.
I do. Thanks. So I do not want to slight the many things that happen between the beginning of the novel, which I've given some attention to, and the end of the novel, which I'm about to turn to. It is filled with relations, her concern about her daughter, the influence of a woman whose name is Kilman, and that might be a name to play with, her attraction to her friend Sally Seton, and the fact that a former lover named Peter, who's associated with a penknife, which may be a Freudian image, you can play with that if you like, is at the party as well. And she's very happy to see him as part of the history of her life, even though she's not trying to resurrect any particular feelings with him. This is not a novel about adultery. Her husband exists in the novel as a father to the daughter. That's important, Richard as father to Elizabeth, and as a marker that she's a woman of certain means and he's a person of certain stature. But before we get to the very end, there's a scene where the Bradshaws arrive late and they share the news of Septimus's death. Septimus was a patient of this great doctor. And then it says near the end of the novel, a young man, that is what Sir William is telling Mrs. Dalloway, Mr. Dalloway. Notice the present tense. It's what Sir William is telling at this moment, Mr. Dalloway had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. So even though she's aware of how dangerous it is to live even one day, she wants this party to be a success. The party is on the side of life. And here's this reminder that death is everywhere, a memento mori, a reminder of death. And it says that she went on into the little room where the prime minister had gone. Perhaps there was somebody there. And she's beside herself with not being able to get the suicide out of her head. And she imagined what it would be. She remembers throwing a coin away, that this young man who had killed himself, had he plunged holding his treasure, if it were now to die, were now to be most happy. That's from Othello. She wondered how she would deal with a death. And then it says, then she had felt it only this morning, there was the terror, the overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life, to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was in the depths of her heart an awful fear. Even now, quite often, if Richard had not been there reading the Times so that she could crouch like a bird and gradually revive, send roaring up that immeasurable delight, rubbing stick to stick, one with another, she must have perished. That is, she needs the presence of her husband. She needs the comfort of home. But that young man had killed himself. That is, how could he have given up the love of life that she feels in this moment? And the rest of that passage is her trying to make sense of what he did without condemning him, and certainly without thinking that his presence, the presence of his death, is a blight on her party. She looks out a window and she sees a woman in another room, an old woman going to bed. The woman puts out the light and she thinks, fear no more the heat of the sun, a Shakespearean line about the peace that people have when they're dead. And she says, she must go back to them, that is to the party. But what an extraordinary night. She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. So again, like an artist, she can imagine what it's like to be somebody else. The great glory of literary fiction is to empower readers with empathy for what it's like to be other people, what it's really like to be other people. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. That is, that he took some control over his life that was plagued, of course. The clock was striking, there are the hours. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. But she must go back. She must assemble. There's that notion of bringing people together, of hosting a party. She must find Sally and Peter, her friends, and she came in from the little room. But where is Clarissa, said Peter. He was sitting on the sofa with Sally. So the camera has shifted from this room upstairs where Clarissa has been, we've been inside her mind, and it goes back to the dramatic scene where there's dialogue and quotation marks, and Peter is asking that question of Sally. Where is Clarissa? Where's the woman gone to, he asked. Where's Clarissa? And that becomes the operative question as Peter misses seeing his old lover somewhere at the party. And then it goes on for several pages as she returns to the party, sees her daughter Elizabeth, thinks about youth and age. Peter speaks to Elizabeth. Peter wants to divorce and marry someone else. Peter's watching Elizabeth, who is seen by Sally. And then there's a scene where Sally watches Elizabeth watch her father. That is, one of the things you can do at a party is not just people watch, but people watch people who are people watching. A tremendous satisfaction. So one of the last paragraphs, for her father had been looking at her, Elizabeth, as he stood talking to the Bradshaws. And he thought to himself, who is that lovely girl? And suddenly he realized that it was Elizabeth, that he had not recognized her. She looked so lovely in her pink frock. Elizabeth had felt him looking at her as she talked to Willie Titcomb. Now I want to say that I'm in the home of my youngest daughter, Francesca, who this past Friday got married in Mystic, and I was what's called the father of the bride, happily, the first wedding of my children. Tremendous joy, as anybody in this room, parent or otherwise, knows when you look at a loved one, whether a child by blood or marriage or just someone you really care about, what a great satisfaction, how much of life is looking at someone you care about. He suddenly realized it was his Elizabeth. She realizes that he's looking at her. And of course, there's nothing untoward, certainly nothing sexual, nothing to make her uncomfortable. This is what parents and children do when they apprehend each other. A great satisfaction. And again, if we have people in the room who are blessed to have relations with young people, what a satisfaction to just be in a room with a young person, whether 2 or 4 or 22, and just see them, just apprehend them, take them in. I have a father-in-law who is now 96. He is quite capable of having conversations. He's not impaired. His memory is excellent, but he gets endless satisfaction sitting in the family room when he has company over, just watching young people be there. And at his age, even I at 68 am a young person. So he looked at her, he said, and he had wondered, who is that lovely girl? And it was his daughter. That didn't make her happy. So in other words, he repeats the story that we just heard in his head. And then there's a conversation between Sally. And then it says, Lady Rossiter stands up and says, what does the brain matter compared with the heart? And Peter says to Sally, I will come, said Peter. I'm at the very end of the novel now, but he sat on for a moment. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? There's that opposition again. The terror that these valuable things can be lost in a moment, and the ecstasy of when you experience it. And the root of ecstasy is being outside your own body, to be ecstasis, to be out of the limitations of your body. He thought to himself. So what is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was. So the last line of the novel has Clarissa assembled. She says, not I must assemble other people, I must assemble. The last line of the novel is Clarissa clarified, for there she was. That is composed, presented, and apprehended, seen, even if not comprehended. And this is what I mean when I say that's that little interlude of Father Richard and daughter Elizabeth. He doesn't say he understood her. He had a new insight into her mind or her character. He talks about what she looks like and apprehends her, sees her the way someone might see someone if they painted a picture or took a photograph. And that's the last celebration of the novel. That terror of that feeling again, felt now by Peter, that it's a very, very dangerous thing to live even one day, and the ecstasy of having the courage to plunge into the welter of life. So it ends with Clarissa, but it doesn't just end with Clarissa. It ends with a man. Again, he's not in love with her. He's not feeling erotic about her. He may have sentimental, nostalgic feelings. It matters that they were lovers. It matters he's a man and she's a woman. But that it's Clarissa, for there she was, is not because he's excited that they're getting back together or there's some future liaison. And so the last statement of the novel is in the head of not Clarissa, but Peter, admittedly a minor character in the novel. But it speaks for what Virginia Woolf has done as a novelist in apprehending and making us able to apprehend this remarkable, extraordinary, ordinary woman, if you know what I mean. And I'll end there so that there'll be time for questions or comments.
Well, that was fantastic, Mark. Really, really a tour de force. We here is a comment, not a question, and you can just react to it after I read it. First off, this is the best talk about Mrs. Dalloway that I have ever heard. Too often the discussion of any novel is an interpretation particular to the speaker who presents and defends it, often too much. It is too easy to be a Miss Kilman, but not with your remarks. To me, the book is opening up more and more as I listen.
Well, I'm very grateful for that. And I'd like to assure those of you who are listening that that is not a relative of mine. Whoever made those comments, I appreciate your generosity. Truly,
so we don't have another question from the audience yet. If you want to throw in a comment, you can. Or
I just want people to appreciate what I'm not making obvious, because I hope it is obvious. We've moved from, let's say, the 1890s with Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or the 1870s with a very intelligent, sophisticated novel like Middlemarch. And here we are half a century later, and the idea of a big novel in terms of lots of characters, multi-year or multi-generational plots like Wuthering Heights has to work out over 2 or 3 generations. We have a small novel, small s, small n novel in a single day, a very uneventful plot, if there is a plot at all, and no confrontation with public questions of history or the rights of women or what's going to happen with the reform bill or the status of religion, the care of children, the large questions of life and death, but not ponderously put forth in an argument at the party or a conversation at the party, which could easily take place about people talking philosophically about life and death. Instead, it comes through people's blood. It comes in their inner workings. Mrs. Dalloway works through her upsetment over the news of the suicide. Peter intuits this sense that there's something at the party that is unsettling him with a terror and an ecstasy, and he realizes it's being occasioned by Clarissa. And then no explanation other than for there she was. Look how far we've come from Reader, I Married Him, or the success of Dorothea Brooke in her life, or the unsuccess of Pip in his. Big questions about plot and wills and legacies and marriages and children. These are people who are married. There's a daughter that matters enormously in this novel, but it's a radically different kind of novel, in the same way that, although it is more conventional, Howard's End is a radically different kind of novel. And when we turn next time to Graham Greene, who I remind you was very critical of the modern British novels as written by most of his contemporaries, that it ignored the problem of evil. That even as people like Henry James mocked the Victorian novel as loose, baggy monsters, that is good storytelling, but it lacked the integrated discipline of art, of fine art, which of course is what Henry James is most known for, and he called them loose, baggy monsters. Graham Greene said what those monsters had over the contemporary novel in his day was that they took the problem of evil seriously. And Graham Greene, who was fascinated with sin and evil, who converted to Catholicism and therefore was especially rabid, zealous in his faith, he is fascinated by the problem of evil. And so we are going to move from this impressionistic, full air, summer day novel to the dark confines of Graham Greene and Brighton Rock. And again, we have to remind ourselves that when we talk about what's modern about the modern British novel, what's anything about any moment in cultural history, it's not one thing, it's not one theme. Shakespeare wrote histories and tragedies and comedies. He wasn't schizophrenic. He saw life with many different visions of it. Graham Greene has a very different vision of what the small society is like, looking at a gang with a very perverse young man, Pinky, at its center. And I want to encourage you to read that novel with the attentiveness that you would give to a good thriller. That is, there's a plot for sure in Brighton Rock, but with the sensitivity that you've given to any of these novels, recognizing that it's a work of art. And you will see how a writer like Conrad and Graham Greene in the same vein can explore the heart of darkness without going to Africa.
Got it. So Mark, this is something that I was curious about. Poked around the internet a little bit, didn't really come up with much. Now, Virginia Woolf had plenty to say about Ulysses. I'm just wondering, what do we know about what Joyce thought about either Mrs. Dalloway or Virginia Woolf?
Well, I will say that I wish I were better prepared. I'm sure at one point in my middle-aged life, I knew the answer to that question. I can't say that I do. It's certainly possible he had an opinion that's recorded. I will say that in an internet age, it should not be difficult for anyone disappointed by my ignorance to Google James Joyce on Virginia Woolf and find out. What I think is interesting about Virginia Woolf's reaction to Joyce, and this goes to the doubleness in Mrs. Dalloway. Remember that inside, outside, age, young, ecstasy, terror, is that she was deeply critical about him from what you might call an aesthetic point of view, that he was indecent, that this is not what novels have to do, and that a lot of it is boring. And let's be honest, I am a great admirer of Ulysses. I have talked about that book in academic environments and outside 20 times or more. And I agree, there are many parts of Ulysses that are boring. It's not possible to write a long book without parts of it being boring, in my view. Edgar Allan Poe had a theory of art that any long work of art has to drag, and that therefore the highest works of art were poems, short poems and short stories. And Son of a Gun, that's what Edgar Allan Poe tended to write. He wrote one novel. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great romantic poet and critic, was asked what he thought of Paradise Lost, which I have taught to undergraduates. Nobody has said to me when they graduate whatever college I was in, oh, by the way, Professor Schenker, I really loved reading Paradise Lost. It's a masterpiece, but there are long stretches of boredom, even admitted by me, who loves the novel and has taught it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge said of Paradise Lost, even people who admire it don't want it to be longer. So there is a way in which her claim about Ulysses sometime being boring, but to her credit, and here's the other point, the rest of my point in her doubleness, she extols what he's doing, that she says he's on to something, and other young writers, in trying to discard the machinery of the conventional novel and get at those things that just because they're small should not be seen as unimportant. And there's a special kind of genius in being able to see in the talents of someone you're critical of what makes them valuable. And it would not surprise me if Jimmy Joyce was not capable of that kind of generosity. James Joyce was brilliant, but he could be a petty person in a way that I don't think Virginia Woolf was inclined to be petty. But again, this is something I think easily looked up. And so I encourage anyone who's curious about the answer to what Joyce thought about Woolf and her work could do.
Well, I'll take another crack at it. What I found was that you're almost overwhelmed by all the search results related to Woolf's views on Ulysses rather than the other way around. That's why I couldn't really find anything myself doing it quick. But I'll look again. But here's another comment that you can react to. I felt a real gem of modernism in an otherwise gem of a book. One of my very favorites was the description of shell shock and taking care of that poor veteran by his bewildered, loving wife long before we all became conversant with PTSD.
Yeah. So it has to be said that Virginia Woolf was plagued all of her adult life with mental illness, what the society called madness in this romantic sense, the madness of the poet, the madness of writers. She had a very tenuous hold on reality at times. And so she felt a special sympathy, I'm sure, with the PTSD Septimus Smith. It's not insignificant that she planned for Clarissa to commit suicide. Instead, the fellow who was ill, mentally ill, commits suicide. And then within 16 years of publishing this novel, she, Virginia, feeling herself losing her senses, commits suicide. So I think she had a special sympathy. She put in her notebook that she included Septimus so that she could register what life is like from the point of view of both the sane and insane. And again, sane and insane is a legal definition, but the writers in the beginning of the 20th century were fond of using madness in the romantic sense and insanity, not in the legal sense, but just as a shorthand for mental illness. You do not find the expression mental illness used very much, a kind of shorthand. So she would have been very knowledgeable about what that was like. And I think you'll find that any writer who suffered themselves from mental problems is very good about writing about other non-real scenes. So Dostoevsky, in his own heated consciousness, in his drunkenness, is very good at writing scenes of disturbed people, hallucinations, dark dreams, because he had firsthand experience.
Got it. Got it. Thanks. That was it. That was the last comment, unless someone's typing one right now.
Well, I'm going to
Coming up.
say, again, not rushing off as I had to 2 weeks ago, and I thank you for your indulgence. But since I've said everything I want to say, including a little preview of Brighton Rock, because I am available always for questions or comments that come after the session by email, I will say again that Michael has been good enough to invite me back for a course to be determined and dates to be established in the spring. And we'll be looking at 4 works of fiction in the same kind of culturally integrated way that we can talk about the novels while talking about the set of novels. I find that very satisfying. I trust that you do too. I will happy to have enough time to say again, thank you to everyone for coming and for your attention. Many thanks to Michael and his staff for making this come off so apparently effortlessly. A lot of work goes into it. And I very much look forward to seeing you next time for Brighton Rock.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Another great session. As usual, we'll have the recording probably within a couple days. And we'll see you all next Thursday.
Thank you. Stay well, everybody.
Take care, Mark.
Bye.